Butler Library. We're very excited to present this conversation with Daphne Koller. My name is Sree Sreenivasan. I'm the university's first Chief Digital Officer, a member of the journalism faculty at Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism. I've been here for 20 years, and I've seen more interesting things about the future of education in the last 6 months than maybe in the previous 20 years. What I'm doing at Columbia is trying to figure out where and how Columbia can enhance a lot of the online and digital education it is already doing, and it's been doing so many interesting things. And I want to just show you a couple of pictures. One is the reason that I'm doing this, and that is this picture here. I'll show you. These are my now 9.5-year-old twins, and that's a picture of them in the state of Kerala in India. And it's a beautiful beach called Kovalam. But my daughter in 2007 said to me that she saw this TV ad for Go to College Online or onlinecollege.com, and she decided that she was going to go there instead of staying, so that she could stay at home and be with mommy and daddy and never leave us. And I tell people that this is my motivation to get it right. In some ways, I want to make sure she leaves and isn't stuck at home, but also that by the time they go to college, their view of the world is going to be very different from even the youngest students sitting in this room. And that's why I believe every member of the Columbia community, professor, administrator, fundraiser, student, everybody needs to be thinking and understanding what is going on with higher ed and how it's changing and how it's about to change in a very dramatic way. Doesn't mean that we all have to change what we're doing. We just need to be aware of the issues. And so this is part of a series of conversations we hope to have with all of you over the next several months. Among the people that are coming to speak to us very shortly in May, we have Jeff Salingo, who many of you know is a senior editor at the Chronicle of Higher Education, is coming to talk about his book, College Unbound, The Future of Higher Ed and What It Means for Students. We have others also who will be coming, and we'll let you know about all of them in the weeks ahead. If you're following today's conversation, I hope you will use the hashtag #CUKoller so that you can track it, and her Twitter handle is @Daphne Koller and of course @Coursera. The other slide I wanted to show you is to give you a sense of how quickly things are changing. I last saw Daphne at this event that you see, Online Learning and the Future of Residential Education, hosted by Harvard and MIT. And the two presidents who are actually sitting on that stage pointed out that they compete perhaps more closely and more more fiercely than any two colleges on as many fronts, on so many fronts. But here they've decided to kind of work together. So this conversation, which brought together about 50 universities in a very short period of time, and Daphne was part of the conversation, is one of many conversations we all need to be having. And the other thing to think about is the world has changed so much, and you know that this is an example of the change. You've probably seen this photograph. This is the papal inauguration, coronation, I forget what it's called. But you look in 2005, look at how people are, there's one guy with a Nokia phone in the corner, and then you look at 2013 and see that change. Every aspect of human life is changing with the digital, in a kind of digital light speed. We want education not necessarily to change, but to adjust and be enhanced by what we do already with the magic that already happens in the classroom. Before I have Daphne speak, I did want to take a moment of silence for what happened in Boston yesterday. So if we can all just take a moment to contemplate and reflect, I'd appreciate that. Thank you very much. Our thoughts and prayers are with the families in Boston. Today our conversation is called The Online Revolution, Learning Without Limits, and there's perhaps no better person to at least start that conversation than Daphne Koller. She's a member of the faculty at Stanford University, where a lot of new and interesting ideas have been coming from in the online learning space. And what we're going to do today is to have her make a presentation and then take as many questions as we can possibly get in. But we know we won't have time for all the questions, but let's see how far we can get. Daphne had launched Coursera, as you know, last year more formally, and before that she'd been teaching in the computer science department at Stanford. And today she's going to share her thoughts and ideas. Please welcome Daphne Koller.
Thank you, Sree, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. I realize it's a busy time for everyone, and I appreciate you being here. So I actually, following up on this last moment of silence, I grew up in a country where events like what happened in Boston yesterday occur on a regular basis. Probably once every couple of months there is a bus bombing, a car bombing. And so I grew up with extremism as an aspect of life. And one of the interesting things that happened was when we heard about this event yesterday, a couple of our employees sent me an email saying, you know, this is one of the things that if we succeed, we hope to be able to help reduce the amount of extremism and violence. Because extremism, like many other aspects that plague the world, is something including infant mortality, overpopulation, unemployment, and many, many others, are things that can be alleviated by having people be educated and have access to knowledge and access to a better life. And so maybe in 10 years we will have fewer incidents like the ones that we had in Boston yesterday. So in fact, following up on that, when we started Coursera in January of 2012, an incident happened that really, again, drove home why we were doing this, and the sort of amazing lack of access that occurs in parts of the world that are not as fortunate as the ones that we happen to live in. In South Africa, like in many other parts of the developing world, and certainly in most of Africa, there just is insufficient capacity for people to get the kind of education that they want and deserve. In Africa specifically, the constraints are such that in Africa's large public universities, the admit rate is about 1 in 8 among qualified applicants, where the others have very few viable options. So in January of 2012, this led to a real tragedy where there was, in the University of Johannesburg, a handful of slots left open from the standard admissions process. And then they were going to reopen those slots for general admission, and the night before they were going to do that, there was a line of people literally a mile long, standing outside the gate hoping to be first to get one of those positions. And when they opened the gates in the morning, there was a stampede, and 20 people were injured, and 1 woman died. She was the mother of a son, and who she was hoping would get admitted into the university. And so you could say that she literally died trying to give her son a chance at a better life. These tragedies don't come around that often, but this is really emblematic of the kind of serious crisis that we have in many parts of the world that don't have the kind of privileged life that we have here in the United States. So after we launched this movement in April, Tom Friedman wrote up about this in the New York Times. And he put it better than anyone else did before. Tom has quite a way with words. He says that big breakthroughs are what happen when what is suddenly possible meets what is desperately necessary. It's one of my favorite quotes. The desperately necessary was the first slide. The suddenly possible was the grand experiment that Stanford did in September of 2011 that really launched this whole effort. Stanford took 3 fairly advanced courses in computer science and just put them out there for anyone around the world to take for free. And these are pretty advanced, so we were expecting an enrollment of a few thousand people. But within a matter of weeks, each of those courses had an enrollment of 100,000 students or more. And many of you, I'm sure, read about this in the New York Times. So to clarify what that number means, the largest of these courses, when taught at Stanford, has an enrollment of 400. It's my colleague Andrew's machine learning class. It's considered a large course even by Stanford standards, and Stanford has some pretty large courses. That same course had an enrollment of 104,000 students when offered to everyone around the world. So to understand that number, in order for Andrew to reach that same size audience, he would have to teach a Stanford class for 250 years. And by doing so, he would reach 250 generations of very privileged Stanford students, as opposed to the people from every country, every age group, and every walk of life that were able to take his online open class. So these were the first of what is the new generation of what are now called MOOCs, massive open online courses. The success, the amazing uptake of this, I think really led Andrew and myself to stop and think about the opportunity that we had in front of us. Because we could take a Stanford quality education and offer it to people everywhere for what is effectively a zero marginal cost per student. That is, the cost per student is closer to $0 than to $1. And so if you can do that, what can you do in order to make the world a better place? And I think we realized that this was not an opportunity that it was morally possible to pass up. And so at the end of 2011, the beginning of 2012, we spun this out of Stanford and launched Coursera, where we now have 62 university partners offering 337 courses across the range of disciplines to 3.25 million students. It's hard to keep the slide up to date. From 221 countries, every country around the world. And every month, 1.45 million people enroll for classes. Think about the amount of learning that that implies. These are some of the universities that we're privileged enough to have working with us. These are the US-based ones. There's 38 US and 24 that are outside the United States. You can see some of this country's top private institutions. Stanford, Penn, and Princeton were our first three partners. Columbia, we're very pleased to have, Caltech, and many others. Most of this country's top public institutions are also there. Many of the UCs, University of Washington, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Minnesota, and so on and so forth. These are the non-US institutions that are working with us. We had a huge expansion in February, mostly international. We now have 30 of the top 60 universities worldwide, and the #1, #2, or both universities in 14 different countries. We have top universities from Asia, from Latin America, from Australia, and from Europe. Germany, France, Japan, Singapore, and many, many others. And we're very privileged to have an opportunity to offer education that is not just the United States teaching the world, but rather the world teaching the world. And specifically, as part of this expansion, we're now able to offer courses that are taught natively in 5 different languages. In addition to English, we also have courses that are taught natively in French, and coming up very soon, Spanish, Chinese, and Italian in the coming months. And we hope to expand this to other languages beyond that very soon. We started out in computer science. And so sometimes people think that's really all we do, but that's not true. The courses really span the range of disciplines very broadly. You can see there's courses in philosophy, there's courses in literature, courses in business, in engineering, in astrobiology, in art and music, including performance music by 2 different music schools. Really an amazing range of disciplines, pretty much anything that you can imagine. Columbia is offering us 3 wonderful courses in engineering, which we're very proud of. We're actually underrepresented in engineering, so we're really happy to have those, including some people sitting right here in the audience. And you can see that there is some really nice enrollments for these courses that range from 14,000 to 72,000 students taking these courses, which we're really very happy about. Okay, let me talk a little bit about the students. I can talk for hours about students whose lives were profoundly changed by having access to this kind of quality education. And this is really why we're doing this. You get these emails from students whose lives were just completely transformed. So here's just a few examples. Raul is a poor student who lives in Peru, not much computer science education in Peru. He took a bunch of our computer science courses, used that as the basis for Fulbright application, is now coming to study in the United States as a Fulbright scholar. Jolene is from Pakistan. She she took sociology from Princeton, was inspired by what she heard, and is now founding an NGO with a colleague from her class. And Achint is from a small town in India, didn't have much access to education, wanted to become an entrepreneur, and took the gamification class from Wharton and is now participating in an all-India entrepreneurship competition. These are the kinds of access stories that you expect to hear about. These are ones that we find less expected. On the right, you see Daniel. Daniel is a 17-year-old boy who's severely autistic. He has a speaking vocabulary of about 150 words. But he communicates by typing on an iPad, and by doing so was one of the star students in the University of Pennsylvania Modern and Contemporary American Poetry class. Daniel says that this is the first rigorous, meaningful educational experience that he's had after a life of special ed, and that in fact this is actually helping to alleviate the severity of his disease. We get a lot of stories like that from people with learning disabilities, cognitive disabilities, as well as other health disabilities. For example, a couple of months ago, we got an email from a woman who happens to be a Stanford alumna who has stage 4 breast cancer. And she says that she can't really leave the house except to go to the hospital to get her chemotherapy. And this is her one window into the outside world. This is the kind of limits that we really hope to help people overcome in giving them access to education. So with that introduction, let me now talk a little bit about what these courses look like from the inside. What's the student experience for these courses? There's 3 major pillars to the student experience, but first let me give you a high-level view. This is a way for us to try and give students a meaningful course experience, kind of like if they were real registered students in a real campus class. So the course begins on a given day, and then every week there is material the students are responsible for learning, and then every week there's homework that the students are supposed to do. And if they do their homework, they get a grade, and if they get a grade, they can pass the class, and if they don't, then they can't pass the class. And you can see the impact of this simple notion of courses and homeworks and grades in the usage graph here, where the x-axis is time and the y-axis is number of users on site. See that heartbeat pattern? That's the day before the deadline. Every week, the day before the deadline, the students log in to do their homework, just like on campus. And then because they're all in it together, there is a sense of community around it, which is the 3rd pillar of the student experience. I'll talk about those. And then finally, at the end, there is a reward. If you complete the class and you do all the homeworks and you succeed, then there is some kind of credential that you can go and present maybe to an employer or to the Fulbright application officer in order to have a chance at a better life. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So let me talk briefly about the 3 pillars of the student experience. The first is the use of video as a primary medium of instruction. And the thing is, if you shoot video, if you shoot your material, created specifically for online consumption, you can break away from a lot of the shackles that constrain us when we do in-classroom teaching. So specifically, we no longer have to teach at 50-minute intervals for the purposes of room scheduling. You can break up the material in the same way that Sal Khan has done into much nicer, smaller modules that are better fit both to the material itself and to the student's attention span. So students can traverse this material at their own time, at their own pace, rewinding when they need to listen more carefully, fast-forwarding when the instructor is being a bit boring, which happens. Most students watch at 1.5x on a regular basis. And taking notes when they want to. And so really it allows you to traverse the material in a much more personalized way. You could also personalize it further. For example, some students might benefit from having background material that others don't need. Other students might be interested in some extensions that are not of interest to everyone. And so you can really break away from one-size-fits-all model of education that's been forced on us by the need to scale to teaching 150 students in an auditorium. So that's one aspect of the student experience, but this one I think is even more interesting. We all know that students really learn by actively engaging with the material as opposed to just by sitting there passively. And so we've tried to build an interaction in the material in a variety of different ways. Even in the video itself, it's not just a passive experience. Let me show you what that looks like.
These 4 things. Prospect.
So this is one of our instructors. There is sound, but I'm not playing it. You can see he's talking. There's subtitles. And when the video gets the yellow notch, it pauses and the student gets asked a question. The student answers the question, has a chance to, they didn't get it this time, so they have a chance to try again. And this time they got it, and there's an optional explanation, and then the class moves on. Now, this is the same kind of question that we might ask in class of our students, but when we ask a question in class, I talk pretty quickly, so 80% of the students are still scribbling the last thing I said. The ones with their laptops open, they're not usually taking notes. They're on Facebook or buying shoes on Amazon or whatever. And then there's the smarty pants in the front row who blurts out the answer before most other students have even noticed that a question had been asked. And then the question's been answered, the class moves on, most people have not even engaged with the question. Here, every single student engages with a question, giving rise to better learning outcomes. Now, of course, that's not where the meaningful learning happens. The meaningful learning happens in the weekly homeworks. So how do you grade the work of 100,000 students when you're not able to hire 5,000 teaching assistants? So we have two solutions to that. The first is to get a computer to do the grading for you. And fortunately, computers can now grade a bunch of different work, like, for example, in addition to multiple choice and short answers that you saw in the video, there's also, you can grade math in pretty deep ways. And you can grade anything that has a structured form. So you can grade the output of a computer program, a computer model of a physical or a financial system, or even an Excel spreadsheet of a marketing model. Anything where you know where to look for certain parts of the output and so can identify whether it's a correct answer or not can be graded by a computer. And this allows for some pretty deep work in sciences, in engineering, in business, and in many other disciplines. But of course, this does not fully address the need for the kind of open-ended, critical thinking style work that does not have a correct or incorrect answer. In order to address that kind of work, we've put into place, oh, sorry, I forgot one other thing. My apologies. We put in computer-based grading as a scalability mechanism, and then discovered that it has enormous pedagogical benefits. Because when you grade work by hand, there's usually 3 or 4 weeks that elapse between the time that you learn the material, submit the work, get the graded work back. By the time you get the graded work back and you realize that you didn't get the material the first time, the class has moved on. And very few people go back and review and realize that they should learn the material better and do that. Here, because the feedback is immediate, it turns the process into a computer game. The students get the grade back and they say 70 out of 100, I can do better than that. And then they resubmit. And so you can see that in this distribution here where the blue bars are the initial scores for an assignment and the green bars are the final score for an assignment. And you can see that most students gravitate towards having a perfect or almost perfect score. Now, some of you are probably sitting here skeptically saying, well, yeah, if you put a monkey next to the keyboard, if you give them enough attempts, eventually they'll get the right answer. And does that actually indicate that they're learning something? So we've tried to do analytics to judge that question. And here's one way of suggesting that it does. If you look at students who had similar performance on the initial submission of problem set 1, and check for the ones that did this repeated mastery-based learning versus the ones that didn't, the ones that did not only do better in problem set 1, they also do better on the initial submission of problem set 2. Which means that it suggests that they have a better basis for learning for the next assignment, as opposed to just they happened to guess until they got the right answers. And so this is actually very encouraging because it suggests a mechanism by which we can get better learning outcomes, and I'll come back to that at the end. Now to the whole notion of peer grading, which I preempted myself a little bit. We put in peer grading as a mechanism for grading at scale work that only humans can currently grade. And the way this works is a person, as the instructor, creates a grading rubric, which defines criteria by which students are assessing the work of other students. They are very precise criteria, like were the following points made, were the following causal connections made, were there enough scholarly citations, things that are well specified, but that a computer can't really check for. And it turns out that if your grading rubric is well defined, you can actually grade some pretty deep and interesting work. So here is a result from the Princeton sociology class from the final exam. The TAs in the class actually graded all 1,200 or so final exams. And these were hard questions. These were essay questions. These were not regurgitation. And what you see here on the x-axis is the score assigned to the work by the TAs, and on the y-axis, the score assigned by the students in the peer grading process. And you can see that there is a very strong correlation between them, suggesting that when the peer grading rubric is well defined, this actually gives you some pretty robust answers. Now, it turns out that peer grading really opens the door to the kind of exercises that you never thought would be doable at this scale. So here, for example, is a project from the Wharton Business School design class. This class was centered around a semester-long or final project, which started out where the students submitted first a problem specification, a prototype, and finally an actual artifact. And at each stage of the way, they got feedback from 5 of their peers. So by the end of the process, they'd gotten 40 pieces of feedback, which really enriched their work. And you can see that at each, you can see some of the final results that were submitted as part of the final submissions. And some of these are pretty interesting and creative artifacts. A laptop table, a device for charging mobile phones when the hotel forgets to put a piece of furniture next to it, which happens, and a space-efficient work desk. And only after selecting these based on how cool they looked did I notice that they actually came from 3 different continents, suggesting the worldwide reach of this. Now, the other aspect of peer grading is that, in some sense, like auto grading, we put this in as a scalability mechanism only to discover its pedagogical benefits. Because if you think about peer grading, the student has just finished doing an assignment on exactly this topic. This one's a bit more open-ended. For example, an essay question, the student has just finished writing an essay on the same topic, struggling with how to solve the question, came up with a particular way of doing it, and all of a sudden sees that there's 5 different ways in order to solve that same problem, showing them that there's really multiple approaches to take to a single problem, which in my opinion is one of the key steps towards teaching creativity. And for this reason, a lot of our instructors that started out doing peer grading in the MOOC context, simply for scalability purposes, are now adopting it into their on-campus courses because it's a pedagogical mechanism. The final pillar of the student experience in one of these classes is the community. The students are all together taking the same material at about the same time, which means that if you ask a question, even if it's 3 o'clock in the morning, somewhere someone is awake on the discussion forum and answers that question. And so effectively, this creates a rich community where students help each other along over the hard bits, substituting for one of the things that simply doesn't scale, which is the instructor's ability to answer questions from thousands and thousands of students. So this is one aspect of community, which we're told by our students is really a very cooperative and collaborative environment, even in these large online courses. The other aspect of community, which emerged organically, is students who meet up physically once a week to work on the material in the class. They would post on the forum, we're meeting in this coffee shop in Kandahar Thursdays at 5, come join us, and people would come and they do that. And we have, I think, about over 2,500 Coursera communities right now in most countries around the world. I'm going to skip past this. So let me just talk about the final piece of this, of the student experience, which is what happens at the end. What happens at the end is the students get this credential. So what does this credential look like and what does it mean? This is credentials 0.1. This is what Stanford let us do at the very beginning of the process. It's a letter from the instructor. It's signed personally by the instructor. And at the bottom, there is a whole bunch of legal boilerplate that basically says this is not a Stanford class. It bears no resemblance to a Stanford class. It doesn't confer Stanford credit. And furthermore, we don't even know who the student is. Now, despite the somewhat vacuous nature of this credential, we had institutions that on a regular basis gave college credit to students presenting a Coursera credential. We have a lot of employers for whom this credential got students through the door for an interview. We have a student working from Kazakhstan at Twitter on the strength of taking a bunch of computer science courses on Coursera. So nevertheless, this was useful, but we wanted to provide students with something more meaningful. And so version 1.0 of Credential is something that we put in place in January of 2013. This is a verified certificate. This is a way for a student to verify their identity using a government-issued ID compared to their webcam photo, and at the same time they create a biometric profile that consists of keystroke patterns. Turns out that if Sree and I type the same phrase, it's going to look very different in terms of the rhythms, and I can't forge his and he can't forge mine. It's very difficult. And so a student establishes this biometric profile, which allows us to ensure that it is they sitting at the keyboard doing the work throughout the course. And so at the end of the course, they can get a verified credential that actually carries the university brand, and that's something that's very meaningful to a lot of our students. This is not free in the sense that the access to the content is and will remain free, but this actually bears some costs, both to us and to the students. It's not a hugely expensive proposition. It costs about $50 and is purely optional. And it is actually a way for us to make this effort sustainable. In the first quarter of 2013, even though we were only running as at a pilot in a small handful of classes, it brought in a revenue of $220,000. Now, that's not a huge amount of money, but given that it was running in only 5 classes and we have 337, you know, there's a real potential there for making this a sustainable effort with this type of approach. Nevertheless, because we feel strongly about keeping things accessible, we put in a financial aid program. If students feel like they really need the verified certificate and they can't afford it, people living in Africa or in India, they submit a financial aid application and we basically accept it. Over 1,000 applications have been accepted. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. There's a student from Bangladesh who wants to study energy in order to bring electricity to the half of his country that doesn't currently have it. Or a student from Chile who, for family reasons, wants to study Huntington's disease for a PhD and wants a verified certificate as a way of enhancing her application for a PhD program in the United States or in Europe. And there's a whole bunch, I mean, there's 1,000 of them, literally. And they're, you know, very touching. The final interesting point about signature track is that it turns out that having skin in the game is actually helpful. So what you see here is the percentage of people who complete the course from among, so the blue bars are the signature track and the red bars are everybody else. You can see that by and large completion rates are not very high. Most people don't actually even intend to complete the class in these courses. They come in because they're curious. They want to explore. Whereas completion rate in signature track is getting close to 80%. But what's even more interesting are the bars on the right. These are students who came in with a declared intent to finish every piece of work in the class. They filled out a survey saying, I commit to completing this class. And even so, the ones in signature track have a higher retention rate than the ones that don't, showing that having a little bit of money in this actually helps people stay retained. Okay, I'm going to pop up a level now and talk a little bit about 2 of the higher level ramifications of this. The first is the data. We collect an amazing wealth of data from this platform because every single interesting event is instrumented. Pause, rewind, fast forward, submit a quiz, submit a form post, look at a form, everything is recorded, and at a scale of tens of thousands of students. So you can start answering questions that you've never been able to answer before. For example, here is in the context of a particular course, the kind of insight that you can get. Here is a distribution of wrong answers to one of the exercises in Andrew's machine learning class. Each little cross is a one-off wrong answer, a unique one. The big cross at the top left is where 2,000 students got the exact same wrong answer. If it was just If it was just 2 students in a class of 100, you would never notice, but when it's 2,000, it kind of jumps out. And so Andrew and his TAs looked at this answer and figured out what was wrong with it, and now every student who logs into the platform and submits that answer doesn't get a sorry you're wrong, gets a sorry you're wrong, and you might want to think about it this way, which helps them arrive at the right answer faster. You can also answer questions at the level of higher level pedagogy. For example, does it help to show the instructor's face in the videos? Some people say yes, other people say no. Now we can actually test it using a mechanism called A/B testing. It's used on every single website in Silicon Valley to basically partition the group of users into 2, see which one does better, and the one that does better, the entire platform converts that experience in a matter of days, which is how these platforms constantly improve all the time. We've never been able to improve at that pace in pedagogy, but now we can because we can do A/B testing, for example, on showing the instructor's face. So you're probably sitting here waiting, so does it help to show the instructor's face? Unfortunately, I'm not going to tell you. And the reason I'm not going to tell you is because the students who didn't get to see the instructor's face complained that it was unengaging, and the complaints were so aggressive that they basically had to stop the experiment in the middle. So at least we know what the students think they want. So this brings me to the final high-level concept here, which is that of improving learning outcomes. There's two distinct places where we can improve learning outcomes. The first is in the online platform, the second is in our own face-to-face teaching. In the online platform, there is a seminal paper going back about 30 years to renowned educational researcher Benjamin Bloom, who studied 3 different populations of students. Lecture-based students, and this is the distribution of achievement scores. These are students taught in a lecture. Students taught in a lecture, but in a mastery format, which means they couldn't move on to the second topic before demonstrating mastery of the first. And the third is the students taught with an individual human tutor, which also provides personalization in addition to mastery. And you can see that each of these improvements gives a 1 standard deviation, or sigma, improvement in performance over the previous one. So Bloom points out that we can understand this if we look at the median of the distribution in the lecture-based class. So in that class, half of the students are going to be above that threshold and half are going to be below. If we use that same threshold in the individual tutoring population, 98% are going to be above that threshold. So here's an intervention that brings 98% of our students to be above average. That sounds pretty cool, right? Hence the 2 sigma problem, because as a society, we can't afford an individual tutor for every student. But maybe we can afford a tablet. And so now the question is, can we use technology to move us from the blue curve to the red curve and ultimately to the green curve? And the nice thing about computers is that they have no problem with mastery. They don't mind showing you the same video 5 times. They're not even going to get judgmental about why you don't get it. The green curve is a little harder. We've already shown some elements of personalization, but we're nowhere close to being at the level of an individual human tutor. But I think it's a really exciting research goal to try and get there. The second place where we can improve education is in how we teach on campus. This is one of my favorite quotes from 19th century educator Edwin Slauson, who said the college is a place where a professor's lecture notes go straight to the student's lecture notes without passing through the brains of either. Not the most flattering description of a lecture, but perhaps not entirely untrue. So maybe what we ought to do is go from this, which is a typical situation, to something that looks more like this, where students get a lot of their content in a much more interactive and engaging format before coming to class, and then come to class for an actual active learning interaction with their fellow students and with the instructor, for an actual dialogue that teaches them critical thinking skills, problem-solving skills, and so on. So to summarize this, Christian Terwish from Wharton Business School is one of our Coursera instructors who taught an operations management class. His final lecture, which you can find on YouTube, is a case study of Coursera from an operations management perspective. And he argues that education is a travel along this Pareto optimal frontier, where you trade off faculty productivity with student learning. So individualized instruction, like in office hours, is very inefficient, but gives great learning outcomes. Lecture is more efficient, but gives worse learning outcomes. He argues that MOOCs basically provide us with a brand new Pareto optimal frontier, which we can use in a variety of different ways. We can take learning outcomes from traditional instruction, keep them the same, and decrease costs considerably by offering, for example, education to people around the world at 0 marginal cost. Or you can take the same cost, the same productivity, and use this blended learning format to increase learning outcomes at the same cost that you're spending today. And so basically we can traverse this frontier to give us a new trade-off between cost and outcomes. So I'm going to summarize now with just 2 high-level statistics about these. These are my final 2 slides. The first is this breakdown of our student population. Currently, 80% of our students actually have degrees. Half of them have advanced degrees. And partly it's because we couldn't, most of these courses are not credit bearing, so if you don't have a degree, the opportunity cost here is pretty high for you to take a non-credit bearing class. But also it's because the formal 4, 6, 8 years of education in your life end there, and then there's the next 50 years of your life. And right now, the stuff that we learned in college 15, 20 years ago is really not enough to keep us productive and understanding of modern life. And so we think there's a tremendous opportunity here for people who are no longer in college and really don't have a lot of opportunities in order to enhance their learning. I mean, they can find a babysitter 3 times a week and go to a community college. They can watch stuff on PBS or on the internet, a very lonely experience. This is a much better way for people to engage in lifelong learning. The second breakdown, which I think is even more important, is the geographical breakdown. Only a third of our students are in the United States. 40% of our students are in what the State Department defines as the developing world. There are students in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in parts of the world that really do not have access to education, the kind that we started out this presentation talking about. So I think there is a tremendous opportunity here to take something that has been a privilege of the very few and turn it into a basic human right. So let me just end with one final anecdote. In September, I was here in New York at the launch of the Education First initiative at the United Nations. And this is an effort to bring education to all the many people in the world who do not currently have access to it. And at that meeting, they were talking about traveling in Africa, in places like refugee camps in the Congo, where people live in grass huts on a cup of food a day. And when you ask them what they most want, by and large, they don't say better food, and they don't say more food, or they don't say better shelter. They say they want a better education for their children, because they know that that's the only way for their children to break out of the cycle of poverty that they have and really make a permanent better life for themselves. Thank you very much.
Let's take some questions. We have about 20 minutes for questions. Please identify yourself, and Daphne is going to repeat the questions so that we can record what you're saying.
Hi, I'm Marvin. I'm a junior in Columbia College. So first of all, that was an incredible presentation. I was wondering if the slides will be available online or summary.
Yes,
Okay.
the slides will be available online.
Fantastic. And my question is this. So I'm a computer science and poli-sci major here at Columbia, and I feel like one of the problems with a lot of my classes is that they often jump into theory more so than application. And two of the best computer science classes I've taken here were both taught by adjunct professors who work in the industry full-time and just teach their classes 1 day a week. Their databases and Rails. Or is Coursera doing anything to engage industries and adjunct professor types with your startup, with courses there, and do you foresee that?
Well, right now our focus is on university content. It's a lot easier to curate university content because effectively we have people like Sree here who can look at the courses that Columbia offers and give us really courses that are amazing, the best of the best. And if I have a whole bunch of industry lecturers to choose from, it's a very hard vetting and curating process to make sure that we maintain the kind of quality that we've had. So the answer is we would like to get more industry content in, but it has to be done carefully so as to maintain quality standards. There is a lot of emerging partnerships between industry and academia in constructing content that is specifically geared for shifting people more and training people in a way that is more suited to the needs of the workplace after they graduate. And so we're hoping that we might be able to leverage on some of those as well going forward. Okay, yes.
Hi, my name is Don, I'm a junior at Columbia also. I'm just curious about how you were able to reach so many people in such a short time.
So the question is how we were able to reach so many people in such a short time. It's a combination of two things. So first of all, we have a very round marketing budget. It's zero. We don't market. We've had, as you might have seen, a fairly impressive amount of media coverage. That helps. But really, a lot of our incoming users come from social media. People, it's spread virally. People tell each other about this great course that they've taken, suggest that their friends take it with them. And so we've seen, for example, especially in our early days, entire countries coming online in a matter of weeks. So you'd have a few students, and then 2 weeks later, it'll be a whole bunch of students in the country because it's permeated the social network of that country. So I think that's the sort of short answer. I'm going to go this way, actually, yeah. So, yes?
Can you say something about how you grade the short answer questions? I mean, when it's just a name, that's one thing, but the first example you showed seemed a little more complex.
Yeah, so the question is how we grade the short answer questions. The technical answer is that it uses regular expressions, which gives you more flexibility than just template, but it's not necessarily the final answer to how you should do this, and we have some ideas on how to do this better. But right now, it seems functional for a fairly broad range of questions. Yes, and I'm going to go then to the other side. Yes?
Hi, I'm Anirudh. I'm a junior student at Columbia. I have like two quick questions. One was, sometimes students who are in vigorous schedules in college or professionals who are working, they sometimes don't have the time to complete assignment or an exam. So does Coursera allow you to complete a particular course after the instructor has finished teaching, so it's open and they still can get a statement of accomplishment? And my second quick question is, will Coursera provide sort of an API so that other developers start developing applications on it on other platforms?
Okay. So the answer to, so the first question was, do we allow people to continue completing the course if they dropped out for a while because of some constraints and didn't end up successfully completing? The answer is that it actually partly depends on the university. If the university wants to keep the course open, then they can. If they don't, then the course closes. What we don't do is we don't give statements of accomplishment for this really open-ended work, because it seems to sort of, it begins to become a question of if you completed the course in 10 weeks versus you completed it in 30 weeks, is it really the same statement of accomplishment? The second question, I'm actually glad that you asked that, because it was the slide that I skipped. Remember I skipped a slide? I'm glad you asked that. Right there. In last week, a week and a half ago, we actually announced that we're going to become an app platform in the same way that Facebook is a platform for social apps. We're going to become a platform for educational apps. There's going to be APIs that developers can develop too, and you can do things like multi-student games, different kinds of simulators, note-taking tools, group construction tools, auto-graders of different kinds, anything that plugs into a very rich set of APIs that give you access to the underlying data model can then be used and will create a rich ecosystem that will allow both students and instructors to basically construct a class from reusable modules that all work together relative to a shared data model. We will help people, initially mostly our university partners, but down the line maybe others, to scale this from, if you have something that works for a single student, how do you run it at MOOC scale, and things like that. So, so we're very excited about this direction, because even to the extent that there's educational apps that exist today, they're all kind of standalone, and it's very difficult to create a coherent class from them. And so we're really hopeful that this will allow people to create much richer experiences for their courses. So I'm going to go to that side now. Yes, in the back.
Hi, I'm Cooperative. I work in career education. I was curious as to if you could say a little bit more about how you ended, about the developmental functions of Coursera as sort of open online education, and specifically about how you see the global digital divide impacting the mission that Coursera has taken on, and what you might be doing with that.
Right. So the question had to do with the digital divide, which is certainly a problem in the developing world, but frankly a problem even here in the United States, where kids who grow up in inner cities do not have the same access to technology or even the same awareness of just the options that are available to them as people from more advantaged backgrounds. And I think it's a real issue. It's not a problem that we can solve ourselves, but we've started to partner with various organizations in order to try and, in organizations like the World Bank, for example, to try and penetrate better into various countries in the developing world and provide people with better access. Turns out the State Department is actually running an experiment using our content in what's called American Spaces, which are spaces around the world that the American embassies keep, and they are you know, running Coursera courses there for the local community, and if we'll see how it works out, and does it actually increase access to those courses. That being said, the digital divide, I think, is a serious issue that we as a world need to start solving. And fortunately, that's starting to happen. So if you think about India as I think a really good example, India's had a huge digital divide problem, but they just finished creating a broadband network that connects 250,000 Indian villages. That's not every village in India, but now every village in India is within driving distance of one of those villages that has broadband connection. And so you can come in, sort of download what you want for the week, do your homework, and then go somewhere else. And it gives access to people whose village is not connected. India also finished the development of the Akash tablet. I don't know how many of you have seen it. It's an interesting device. It looks like a very, very cheap and cheesy iPad, but it's fully functional, even if a little bit slow. And you can basically run, our stuff runs natively on the Akash tablet. It costs $40 to create one, $20 after the subsidy from the Indian government. They're hoping, I think, by 2015, as part of their Millennium Development Goals, to get one to every Indian school child. So I think that countries are coming to the solution of this, not primarily for this, but for a lot of other purposes, and we hope to piggyback on that.
We have about 5 minutes left. I also want to tell you that if you'd like to hear about other talks on online learning, other events, please fill out this form. It's bit.ly/Columbia list, or email me. You can fill it in right now if you have a computer. Otherwise, just email me. Let's keep going. Last couple of questions.
Okay, in the back over there.
Hi, I'm Assistant Dean of Brown Assistant Dean of Educational Technology at the Journalism School. I have a question for you. In regard to this content, what is Coursera, what are the conversations that Coursera is having with other universities regarding the high levels of attrition in MOOCs? So can you give us a little bit of an insight on that?
Yes, so I think that when people talk about retention in MOOCs, it's based on a fundamental misconception of what the MOOC population looks like. So a MOOC, when a student enrolls for an on-campus class, they do it with a declared intent to complete the class. If they don't, it's a failure. System's failure or their failure. Most MOOC students, the vast majority, never intend to complete the class. They're browsing, they're exploring. There's, I think, less than a third of them that even have a declared intent to even try doing the exercises. So when you look at for example, among the students who submit the first exercise, 45% actually complete the class. Among the students who sign up for signature track, which is a declared intent to finish, comparable, although much lower cost than signing up for a campus class, it's about 80% completion rate. So I think it's important when people talk about 5% to realize that most of the people enrolling are treating this like a library book. They take the book out from the library, they read a few chapters, they learn something, loan period ends, they give it back. Is that a failure of the book? I don't think so. So I think that's an important thing to think about. Yes, well, Andy first.
Literature, history. Daphne, every time I hear you, I feel myself coming closer to conversion. I love your evangelical fervor. You're very persuasive.
But I knew there was a but.
One thing you said early, the poignant slide you showed of the students in South Africa desperate to get into university. And then I think I understood you to say toward the end that the great majority of your enrollments are people who already have degrees.
That's right.
So I'm having a little trouble putting those two together. What is the promise of this new technology for those who are desperate to start there?
So I think that is a very valid question. So actually I should repeat the question. The question is, if most of our students, 80% of our students have degrees, what does that imply about the ones that don't? I think there is a mismatch, or was a mismatch up until recently between, which is when the survey was done, between the content that we have and that of degree-seeking students. Most of our content was more advanced. For example, the 3 courses that Columbia offers are pretty advanced courses, and that's true for a lot of our content. Now we have 20 what I would call entry-level classes that have just started or will soon start to run. Intro physics, intro chemistry, intro accounting, engineering, math, and so on and so forth. We're going to have a bunch more of those because we've made it a priority. And so I think that that mismatch of content will go away, and we will be able to provide an education that is appropriate for those people who are just starting out in life and really do need a basic education first and foremost before they can make use of the more advanced stuff that we're currently being able to offer them.
Just add that we have lots of such people in this country.
I completely agree. And in fact, that is part of the goal here, is to address the many people who started a degree and never completed it, or many who just thought they would never be able to make it and didn't even start college. So yes, it is not just for the people in Africa and Bangladesh that we're putting up this introductory content. We have an equally serious problem here in the United States.
Okay, we're going to have to pause here, but so that if some of you want to come and just say hello to her. After this, she has a committee meeting with lots of faculty members upstairs. So 2 quick things. I want to point out that was Andrew Del Banco, who has written a book called College, What It Was, Is, and Should Be. And I hope, Andrew, I hope we'll get a chance to hear from you as well. And again, a reminder, if you would like to hear about more of these kinds of events, please fill this in. I see many of you have done this already. If you don't have a chance to write down the bit.ly/Columbia list, just email me and I'll add you to our list. Let's give a big round of applause to Daphne. And we have just a couple of minutes for you to come say hello, and then we've got to rush her upstairs. Thanks, everybody.